Welcome to the Viewless Wings Poetry Podcast, where we celebrate the craft of poetry. Each week we feature interviews with incredible poets, songwriters, and artists, including Olivia Gatwood, Safia El Hilo, Dana Joya, and many more. We also feature periodic submitted poetry episodes. Visit viewlesswings.com to submit your original poetry. I'm your host, James Moorhead, Poet Laureate of Dublin, California, and author of Canvas, Portraits of Red and Gray, and The Plague Doctor. Hit subscribe and follow me on Instagram or Threads at viewlesswings. Katherine Gaffney completed her MFA at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign and is currently working on her PhD at the University of Southern Mississippi. Her work has previously appeared or is forthcoming in Best New Poets, Jubilat, Harper Palette, Mississippi Review, Meridian, and elsewhere. She has attended Tin House's Summer Writing Workshop, 2014, Sundress Publications' SAFTA Residency in 2021, and was a scholar at the Sewanee Writers Conference 2022. Her first chapbook, Once Read as Ruin, was published by Finishing Line Press. Her first full-length collection, Fool in a Blue House, won the 2022 Tampa Review Prize for Poetry. She lives and teaches in Champaign, Illinois. Katherine, welcome to the Viewless Wings Poetry Podcast.
Thank you so much for having me, James.
And thank you for reaching out and sharing your book. I thoroughly enjoyed it and look forward to asking you about it. And your collection opens with a prose poem, The Horse. It's a wonderfully strange poem with a horse born from a carousel that tore from the rods. The images are so beautifully strange. What was your thought process to opening with a prose poem and this poem specifically?
Oh, that's an interesting question. So part of it is emotional, which is that my thesis mentor for my MFA, this was his favorite poem in the manuscript. He has since passed away. So the book came out after, but I think was accepted before he passed. I can't recall exactly the timeline now. But anyway, it's sort of a memorial to him in a certain way. But then in terms of actual book structure beyond just kind of an emotional connection to the poem, I think it feels a little bit like a thesis to the collection in the sense of the horse being able to bestow this sense of wildness, this sense of independence to the speaker of the poem. And so in that thematic regard, I think it's doing a lot of legwork. Imagistically, in terms of thought process, I grew up riding horses, which is where horses do thread throughout the collection. And, quite frankly, I don't recall, it might have been a dream, honestly, but the details about the cloudless morning, the rainy day of her birth was the story of the horse I grew up riding, or her birth. So it's sort of a mixture of her story and then kind of, lifting it into the surreal. I think at a certain point in my MFA, I felt like I was writing so autobiographically that I sort of challenged myself toward the surreal. And this is one of those poems that was born out of that surreal challenge.
And carousels are such a wonderful, will probably survive the passage of time, simple and beautiful and elegant and handcrafted and just fun. I really like carousels. We've organized Fool in a Blue House into numbered sections, each with a quote from a wonderful selection of writers. How did you approach organizing this collection and then selecting these quotes?
Yeah, so originally my thesis, what I defended it under, was titled No One Thought of Birds. And Corey Van Landingham came to University of Illinois my final semester, and she was on my thesis committee. And in meeting with her, I didn't make any major changes before the defense, but she actually suggested the title connects to the structure, so I'll get back to the structure. But she suggested the title of Fool in a Blue House, which is part of a title of one of the poems in the collection. And kind of in talking with her, she sort of brought this idea of theater, which is very kind of like quietly threaded throughout the collection as well. There are kind of these hints at stadiums or boxing rings or performance. And so the 5 acts kind of became an idea for the structure of the collection. And, Act 1 in Roman numerals, kind of in very traditional theater terms. So that's where the 5 figure came in. And then in terms of the quotations that also kind of help frame each section, I was careful as I was working through my MFA and after, because changes were made to this manuscript. This is by far not fully my MFA thesis, but I just would note quotations that stuck with me. And I had like a really long list of quotations. And I try to do that as I read, because I find they come in handy, whether it's as an epigraph or in framing these sections. So I tried to make it poets that I admire and whose work I felt was in conversation with the poems in the section that followed.
Wonderful. Well, Corey Van Landingham is, I interviewed her a year or two ago, so go back in the archives. You really enjoy the conversation we had. She's wonderful.
She is wonderful, yeah.
Well, in Hope Chest, you successfully repeat variants of hope no less than 10 times, which is a challenge given hope is arguably an overused word in poetry. How did you think about the use of the word hope in this poem? Its repetition and avoiding cliches with a word that can, and you successfully did that can become cliched in many contexts.
Oh, interesting. I don't know if I was that conscious of it, the potential of it being cliched. I was asked about this by another poet, this poem particularly, and they were interested in the objectness of the poem. And I explained that it was born truly from a hope chest that my mother bought me. And she felt like it was somewhat taboo to give me a hope chest, given that I as a spoiler alert, I'm not married. And she didn't want me to tell my partner that it had this connection to marriage, because she felt it had this kind of certain weight that she didn't want to, interfere or anything like that. So I just sort of enjoyed the humor of that. To me felt like it deserved a poem. But yeah, I don't know. I think what repetition can do, if it's not too precious, is it can kind of crack open the word and almost detach it from the cliched weight. And so maybe, I don't want to give myself credit where credit's not due, but maybe syntactically and the way repetition is occurring is it's not laying into the saccharine connotations and denotations of hope, but instead trying to lift it out of that context and kind of lean into the to me, I guess the unexpected humor of the nature of the actual object being introduced into my life.
Yeah, it forces you to look at the nuance of the word and not the superficial cliche, and probably that's why it works so effectively. And maybe hope chest as an object too immediately changes the context.
Yeah, and I think, and that's where, there's a couple of poems in the manuscript, and not to hopefully anticipate a question, because I have a bad habit of doing that. For example, there's a poem called Widow's Walk, which is an architectural feature of coastal homes. And the idea was that, your love goes out to sea and you're not sure if they're going to make it home, but you have your widow's walk to go out and look on the sea and see if they're going to return to you, kind of thing. But again, I'm enchanted with these very literal phrases, hope chest, widow's walk, that can then kind of be imaginatively turned and cracked open beyond their actual function. So beyond the function of a chest, beyond the function of this walk on top of a roof of a coastal home. And I don't know if I'm heading anywhere particularly articulate with that, but I think there's something magical about the ways we name things and kind of combine terms to kind of create this new weight. So hope chest doesn't inherently indicate marriage, as an example. And yet I love the Lane advertisement that I found in doing research about hope chests, which is that it's an epigraph. It says, the chances of a marriage ending in the divorce court doubled when the bride has no hope chest. The marketing that comes with it is incredible. So yeah, I think both of those poems, and maybe this is also where the repetition doesn't lean into the saccharine, is I also love to do research, as many poets do. I mean, Wikipedia rabbit holes are the most fun thing ever. I remember when I was an undergrad, I worked with William Logan at University of Florida, and he talked about, he didn't use Wikipedia. I think he was using physical books, but going into a rabbit hole about how sheep's birth their lambs, kind of thing. And I was just really taken with that. And so I think also the historical research and building out into these little personal moments help it not feel like just an abstraction, and I think help again build a lore around that abstraction of hope in the case of the poem Hope Chest.
Yeah, no, poets do more research than people realize on a treasure hunt for cool images and especially cool words that are connected to whatever the research is. And it can be very exciting when you find a cool word associated with what you're researching, and really frustrating when you go in and the language is all very banal or unpoetic. So yeah, I totally get the research element.
Yeah, I was just looking up the anatomy of a boot for a poem, and I was getting really frustrated that I couldn't find like a single term for like the whole bottom of a boot. It was like broken down into like foxing, and which is a great term, but that's only one part of the boot. Anyway, it is funny how you can find those disappointments of like, why doesn't the language hold this thing? Or you have the excitement. Yeah, for sure.
Well, in the poem All For Is, for me at least, creates a voice with a very distinct accent. I'm not going to totally try to impersonate that, but with lines like this: I about fell out when he asked me to pass the boiling pot. Check out back to see the cows are fat and sassy. I have a voice in my head that I'm hearing, which I did not try to impersonate. How does the voice a reader might hear inside their head while reading your poetry play a role in your writing in a poem like that, where there is, I think, a distinctive voice that you were imagining?
That's so interesting. And you say a distinctive voice. Are you hearing like an accent?
Accent, yes, yes.
Interesting. I've never heard that before. So that's a new, I think, yeah, a new thing for me to consider in how my readers are engaging with a poem. I mean, I think sometimes in my imaginative brain, I've been told, I think I had this conversation with Felicia Zamora once, that I can tend toward an older register. And I don't know exactly what that's about. So I don't know if it's like a time thing that plays into the accent feature, because I think I about fell out does sound a little bit maybe, more archaic than contemporary registers. But yeah, I mean, I don't know if I thought of it as an accent, but maybe a certain musicality was where my brain was heading with it. There is a lot of internal rhyme, I think, to this poem. But again, I mean, I think I joke that like this book, and even my current project, doesn't have a terribly good imagination, because I actually, like, a lot of these details are truly rooted in, this is a very autobiographical book, as a spoiler alert. And so the idea that like mice were, scurrying into like cracked foundations, and this poem is very much inspired by my partner at the time was working in the food industry, and sleep was fraught at best. And so he had these very, very vivid dreams that were him at work. And so, at one point he woke up, I don't think this is in this poem, it might not have made it into a poem, but he, says, oh, I have to go make the sandwiches. And he was like talking to me in full sentences about having to go make the sandwiches. And so the cow thing was one of those utterances in the midst of a dream. And I was stunned by it. And of course it made it into a poem. But it's far from my own creation. I have to give credit to like the stunning beings and animals and people in my life that brought it. But yeah, I think music was the guiding force, going back to the sense of accent or stranger register. Music was the guiding force for this poem, for sure.
And in the poem, on watching Marie Antoinette after my love's grandfather died, you write, your grandmother insists you see if your grandfather's crocodile shoes fit, that she'll mail you them once she finds them in this mess. The question I know you will not ask is, but where would I wear them? A question that never left Marie's tongue as she was fitted for the bodice of each new gown. Throughout the poem, you find parallels between two seemingly completely unrelated subjects, and it works so well. How did you approach crafting this poem, which is uniquely poetic in its surprising connections?
Oh, that's great. I mean, again, I have to root it with reality. We, my partner very sadly lost his grandfather to bone cancer. We were living in Illinois at the time, which is quite a distance from Florida. So he wasn't able to make it down before, or he was able to make it down for the funeral, but not before his grandfather's passing, despite that being a potential attempt. And I think we were just like looking to distract from the reality of that loss. And Marie Antoinette was like playing on cable television. And, I was trying to imagine, I asked him, I was like, you get to choose what we watch. I mean, I wasn't going to make any decisions, what was going to be most comforting. And so I think the poem was inspired by the stunning choice to me. It was such a surprising choice, not comedy, not like comfort food, like, Harry Potter for some people or something like that. It was this, the Kirsten Dunst edition of Marie Antoinette is maybe not like completely high art, but like for a mainstream movie, it does feel a little bit more, yeah, I don't know, artistic. And so I think started to dive into this rabbit hole of trying to understand why he chose it, and also start to digest kind of the grief, because I think grief is a running theme throughout the collection. Kind of anticipating grief, or the actual endurance of loss, which is the case for this poem. And it just at a certain point became such a joy because Marie Antoinette, or because the Kirsten Dunst Marie Antoinette is so rich and colorful and lush, that it became just a treasure trove of spaces to then parallel the realities that come with a passing, especially given the imminence of Marie Antoinette, the historical figure's death in the timeline of the film. Yeah, I don't know. It just became, yeah, joyous to kind of find those strange parallels between Florida and like a passing of a patriarch of the family. I think at a certain point there seemed to be so many stunning parallels, and it felt right rather than dissonant as well. From the orchid to you read the line about the shoes, the crocodile shoes, which for our context does feel quite lush, as the silk chapeau, did for Marie Antoinette, although perhaps that was fairly everyday for her. But yeah, I think the clothingness of it, the food, the drink, all of that just seemed to intersect in a way that was so organic, because watching the film was born out of just trying to endure the grief in the immediate wake of the news.
Well, in the poem Remains, you take a different choice. You pose a series of questions, and in contrast to prose, you don't suggest any answers, leaving the reader the freedom to interpret what the poem means to them. How did you approach editing this poem, and given the entire poem is questions, when you should end the poem?
Yeah, that's a really great question. So I think this poem was born out of an April Poem a Day challenge. Those are, if you've ever participated in one of those, they are hit or miss at best. You're lucky if you walk out of the month with like 2 or 3 poems.
Yeah.
And I think this one was originally a bit longer. I think the joy of writing it was just questions beget questions, and you can kind of keep hurtling through that. I think the editing process is deciding which questions are most compelling, or lyric, or imaginative. And some of the questions and the idea, the kind of thesis, or the main image for the poem Remains, was sort of sparked by an article that I was reading about, or a couple of articles, because there's not just one set of skeletal remains that are, kind of discovered in, now, but have been buried together for hundreds, if not thousands of years. But that image is just really stunning to me, of finding these skeletal remains caressing each other, or like about the point of kissing, or something like that. It just felt so eerie and yet heartwarming. So that was sort of that was the impetus for the poem. And I just wanted to know more from them. And obviously, the questions aren't answered. This is not a conversation with skeletons, although potentially that could equally be an interesting poem. But I liked the idea that we don't get any of those answers. And at a certain point, the speaker can like ask whatever they want, because the conversation isn't almost stymied by response. And I think in terms of that final question, because I think it wasn't necessarily, shedding less interesting questions was one, organizing them in a way that had surprising progressions, not just logical progressions, was another. And in that final question, I wanted it to be something a little bit provoking, a little bit sexy, because I wanted to kind of capture the catalyst that was this like seemingly electric connection between these peoples who have been buried together in this very intimate position for so long.
Yeah, I thought it was a wonderful approach, especially given the mystery of the people buried together. It was a wonderful approach. Well, many of your poems, and I've already read a couple of these, have long and wonderfully rich titles that make the table of contents fun to read. A few additional examples. The World is the Goat Who Ate My Dress Clear Off My Body, and On Driving to Find Him at Midnight When All He Could Do Was Turn Left, and one more. A Conversation in Home Depot's Kitchen Department with a Line from Mrs. Dalloway. What is your approach to crafting these rich poem titles that could almost stand alone as micropoems?
Oh, I love that idea about them standing alone as micropoems. I don't know. I'm a sucker for a good long title. I think sometimes don't get me wrong, I think a minimalist title can be intriguing in its own regard because it has so many potentials, but I think there's something about specificity that also takes me in. I think it also speaks to the way I craft poems. I want to kind of get down to the going back to rabbit holes. I want to get down to the exact machinations of lamb birthing or whatever it happens to be. And I think I don't know, there's something enchanting and inviting. A conversation in Home Depot's kitchen department with a line from Mrs. Dalloway. I mean, it started as a conversation in Home Depot's kitchen department, but then again, taking notes about quotations that I love. In this case, it got incorporated into the poem. But with the line from Mrs. Dalloway, it just felt so important to pair with the poem. Because again, I think similar to the Marie Antoinette film, I think the Dalloway or the Wolf novel contrasted with this scene in Home Depot's kitchen department felt like it added another element of tension. And so I think sometimes the elaboration that occurs in the title can kind of push the poem toward a better articulation of its tensions than a short title can.
Very cool. Well, I thought it was, they're wonderfully rich, and that you could almost create a little pamphlet of micro poems from just the titles of many of your poems.
I love that idea, and it makes me think, sorry, I hope I didn't cut you off.
Oh, no.
I love that idea because it makes me think actually of an exercise that Adam Clay had me do had our class do at University of Mississippi during my PhD, which was to take workshop feedback and turn that into a pantoum, or I think it was a pantoum. And so it makes me think that potentially that would be an interesting thing to do, even if it's just an exercise for a collection in progress, but to take longer titles that feel like lines or micro poems and turn them into some sort of repetitive form of poetry to see what happens. I do have a overly ambitious idea someday where the table of contents is an Easter egg poem just from the titles of the poems that all works together. But this is the kind of thing that poets love going down rabbit holes on, is that if you could pull that off and have the order of the poems make sense and the titles of the poems make sense and all the titles strung together be a poem, that would be the ultimate puzzle to solve. But someday. Well, the poem Once Red as Ruin is a multi-part long poem. It's one of my favorites in your collection. The poem opens with an unsettling image. A torn open fetlock, summer, flies, a red so real it turns to fiction, sore, first golf ball of growth, tears to cleft, and then proceeds to interleave historical references of women self-mutilating to protect themselves from men. How did you approach constructing this poem and incorporating the research and more contemporary images while achieving a unified whole, which is a challenging thing to do? Yeah. So this poem I wrote along with my mentor is very involved with this poem, the one who the horse, the opening poem, is sort of dedicated to. It started as wanting to write about horses and if you've ever been around horses, people see them as these very strong figures. And don't get me wrong, they have their strengths, but they are also the most fragile creatures I have ever been around. And that's probably thanks to human breeding. But then they also have this incredible habit of like undoing anything you do to try and help keep them healthy and alive or groomed or anything like that. And so I was really taken with this idea of like rejecting care or rejecting facilitation of life. And so that's where the poem started, was with the horses. And I was bringing in drafts of the poem to these like weekly meetings my mentor and I would have at this like wonderfully crappy Mexican restaurant. It holds a special place in my heart after all of these meetings talking about poetry over chips and salsa. But I realized that the poem needed something else, maybe going back to a conversation in Home Depot's kitchen department with a line from Mrs. Dalloway or the Marie Antoinette poem. It needed something else to kind of buffer against, to have a little bit greater tension. And I think as well, it still felt removed from myself. And so much of this collection is a first person perspective collection. And so I think for me, it started with Saint Ebba the Younger and, to cut off the nose despite the face, which, obviously is a very famous, I guess, idiom. Is that what you would call it? Mm-hmm. A very famous idiom, which was the one I was probably most familiar with and it felt closest to. And then down the rabbit hole of research, I found Saint Wilgefortis. And that's sort of where the poem started to come together, was having these two other figures that were willing themselves or doing something to themselves to kind of fend off what in their context would have been considered like care, stability, etc. Right. And to quickly recap St. Wilfordus, since that's a little bit less familiar to most people I think I've encountered, is that St. Wilfordus was a princess or a noblewoman of sorts. Her father was trying to marry her off to a pagan king, and she, being very devout, was dreading this, and so prayed to God, oh, please do something to prevent this marriage from happening. And he gave her a beard. And I was also really interested in the gender ramifications of that particular story, especially given that growing up horseback riding, as much as like there's horse girl culture, so much of horseback riding is when you're truly working with a horse and cleaning up their poop and washing them. And most days when I would walk out of a barn after riding horses, I was just like caked in dirt. I mean, it is not a particularly effeminate affair when you're actually really, maybe I should say it's also the most effeminate affair, but in kind of maybe like pristine senses of femininity, it is not truly in its true practice. It is not a particularly effeminate pastime. But yeah, so to me, the poem wasn't working strictly with the horses and kind of plugging them into these saints, these historical figures who were also kind of doing this work of making themselves increasingly independent, pushing off, these seemingly, well, the Saint Ebba the Younger, that story of like the pillaging is not necessarily an attempt at care, but working to make themselves independent through even incredibly gruesome means suddenly started to make the images of the horse have a certain weight and have a certain application outside of, I think it became more universal in a sense if you're not someone who's like grew up a horse girl.
Well, a couple more questions before I hand the mic over to you. Metronium is a wonderfully rich short poem that demonstrates how poetry can be so compact. In fact, I'll read the entire poem. Architectonic, stop. This space matronly once ought not to be reduced vestigial to a thrust. Let's write the myth of or mystery at or make whispers of fairies, ghostly dresses singing from their once posts, turning once into ever after. Let's think. In crafting a short poem like this, which I was willed to reread several times, when that's kind of a signal that a short poem has worked, how do you approach revising and editing and whittling the poem down to its core?
That's so funny. So this poem was born out of this architectural theme I had going. And I think like what another poem in the collection, Hole in the Barn Door Quilt, which I had a whole quilt series, I think maybe I have 3 or 4 architecture poems that actually survived through the final manuscript. But the idea of a metronium, I was really interested in these gendered architectural features as sort of a thought experiment to build out the kind of domestic or architectural currents running through the manuscript. What's funny about this poem is I was sort of playing with the research of metronium and kind of borrowing language, or playing with language from the definitions of what a metronium is. And I actually stopped the poem at Let's Think, and I brought it to my thesis mentor in one of our, weekly meetings. And he was just like, I think it's done. Like, so this is actually a draft. And I just kind of abandoned the draft. And I think it does work in its kind of mystery and compression and lack of continuation beyond Let's Think. Because I thought I had to like fully render a thesis, which is generally my impulse. Most of my poems are longer, are more, built out, kind of rendering a full argument. But I think there is something stunning about allowing, and that Let's Think, I think, is the most heavy-handed way to like hand it off to the reader to continue that argument or engage with the argument. But yeah, so funny enough, this one didn't undergo a ton of revision. It was sort of an unintentional fragment that we decided, reading it later, as it seems you did, actually is fully rendered, even if it wasn't intentionally fully rendered.
Yeah, I mean, I've talked to poets who've had very, very long poems that got whittled down to basically a stanza, or like you just said, the stanza somewhere in the middle that's the poem, and all this other stuff is unnecessary. I mean, I think that there's a fear, especially for newer writers, to cutting things. And I think my test, and I brought this up in a recent interview, is if you cut something and 5 minutes later you don't even remember cutting it, well, then that's a pretty strong sign that you didn't need it. And if you cut something and the next day it's aching at you, then well, maybe you went too far and you have to bring it back. So with digital with digital editing tools, you have your revision history, so you don't have to worry about losing it.
No, it's true. And I think from a pretty young age, like I mentioned, I worked with William Logan in undergrad. And I would get drafts of poems back from him where the paper was like about to break because the ink was so heavy on the page. And he was very generous with cutting lines. So I would often get a poem back and it would be like a line or two. And he would be like, all right, well, these lines are great. So start rebuilding the poem from there. So I think the idea of cutting, and obviously there's the very famous phrase, killing your darlings, was something that I was lovingly, brutally introduced to at 18 or 19. As much as it was like very hard at that age when you're so married to the thing you've created kind of thing, I also think it helped in learning that brevity is often an asset, and B, I tell my students all the time, and teaching writing, even academic writing, like, you have to be willing to write more than what you're actually going to turn in, because chances are you're going to have a lot of fat to kind of trim off, for sure.
Absolutely. Well, one more question before turning the mic over to you. The poem In April is striking in its visual form, so slight yet powerful. How did you find the form of this poem, shaped like a fishbowl, as though the poem is swirling in the water?
Yeah, I mean, obviously the fishbowl, the opening line of the poem reads, "She must have carried her belly around like a fishbowl." This whole, another thread throughout the manuscript are poems about my mother. One of the big multi-part poems in the book is about my mother's experience of a heart attack, nearly passing, and living to tell the tale. And so I think with that, some of the consciousness of this book is about my mother and her own fragility. And this particular poem deals with the fragility of her ability to carry pregnancies. Which this poem describes, she had 7 miscarriages and trying to have children, 5 before me, 2 after. And she didn't end up having a second child. We adopted my little brother when she was about 45 years old. But moving away from the content, back to the formal question that you asked, this poem started, being really, really compressed. And, I don't know if you've ever experienced this, but, sometimes a poem, even if it's short, is so dense that kind of like left justified, traditionally spaced poem just feels like there's not enough space for the reader to inhabit the emotions or the images or anything like that. So I started to move it across the page, and then I was like, well, hang on a second. There's this image of the bull, and it's not like terribly concrete, but I think, it does communicate the bull. And so in moving it across the page, it's sort of where I started to see the potential of the bull and trying to create rests and caesuras. That way the reader could have these moments of sitting with the images. And so the poem just gave me the shape in that first line.
Wonderful. Well, now I'm going to turn the mic over to you to read selections from Fool in a Blue House.
Thank you so much, James, again, for this opportunity. I'm excited to share a few poems with you all, along with my cat, possibly, who might be picked up on the microphone. So the first poem I'm going to read is is the titular poem to the collection. I say arguably because the start of the title of this poem isn't actually in the title of the collection. The full title is Like a Salmon, or Fool in a Blue House. I feel like a fool in a blue house. Thought I could curate the life we'd live. Repot herbs in spring, summer dinners on the deck, year-round sex on the couch. Saturday, we'd bake bread. Sunday, we'd walk in the sleepy evening, studying ourselves for the week. But we've got none of that, except for sex on the couch. He's bought in, even with the front door open, weather permitting, where extra quiet becomes a game we play. He says his grandmother in old age was like a salmon, wanting to return to Czechoslovakia. Fuck then die. Fuck then die is a thought I've had in our bed. How a woman in a too large Oxford shirt communicates sex, for me, translates to never getting off my size shirt. Please excuse the Post-it notes. It's just the dishes are dry and could stand to be rehomed, or the mail has piled up again on the counter and I can't find the surface. Perhaps it would be easier to write in a chorus. I've gone about this all wrong. This is not chess or a set of stringy marionettes where, if I leave the pieces for a day, I can return to them unmoved. All right, so the next poem I'm going to read is called The Call, and it's a brief poem. It's a compact poem, which, as mentioned earlier in the interview, is not always my modus operandi for writing poems. But I think compression, it has its place. And so hopefully this poem communicates something different than the other 2 poems I'll be reading for you all. The Call. Sundays, I hear church bells through my kitchen window. Tuesdays, it's sirens. Take a tuning fork to my porcelain sink, re-sing the note for you. Most nights, I hear my name, call to tell you to ask, but you say it must have been the wind. Each time I call, I drop a whole herring down my throat. Harbor salt in my jaw's hinges, working to equate you with salt, or better yet, summer lightning. And the final poem I will read is the closing poem to the collection. So maybe this is like a lightning round experience of the collection. And it's called Curling to a New Sky. The way of winter sleeps restlessly, trying to take with it, sweating with his lungs tire of heaving hot air. Tulips unwreath through winter-worn dirt like young women unbraiding their hair after sleep, curling to new day's sky. But old webs have yet to release dawn's unfrozen dew, and the morning tea is still hot, and the night rum still dark, for it snowed early this morning, and the curb's wildflowers shivered closed, naked girls wrapping themselves in towels. Morning's rise is still slow from the quilts that weighed us down to the cold dawn. Bare arms blink at the sun before slipping back into their knits when wind outweighs the warmth. But we keep trying to entice spring with our bodies, daring to sport a thin sock, to brave the door, hatless at first, daring to defy what the sky tells us, instead telling ourselves that we can will the sky to give.
Wonderful. I always enjoy hearing poems read by the voice of the poet. It adds something so special. So in the title poem and in multiple poems in the collection, the color blue appears. A blue house, a childhood room painted blue, blue sea swallowing a house. Was blue a theme of serendipity when constructing the collection, or an intentional choice as you pulled the book together?
Yeah, that's a great question. It's worked out really well when making Instagram posts, because I just do a bunch of blue emojis, like hearts and like the ocean emoji and butterflies and whatever. But I would say in terms of crafting the poems, it was definitely serendipitous, not intentional. But I do think perhaps there's a subliminal nature of it, which is that I think water is also a recurring image, which I think is where the blue stems from often, not always, but often, in reinforcing the blue house. And I think water is particularly important because although most people wouldn't pin me for it, I am a Florida girl. I was born and raised in the Miami, Fort Lauderdale area and grew up pretty close to the ocean. And so I think that's where the blue comes in. Yeah, is that connection to water that runs throughout the poems.
Cool. Well, finally, what are you working on now?
Yeah, exciting to talk about it. So I'm currently doing a far more researched project. So connecting back to our conversations about poets loving to do research, even if it's not as advertised as other genres of writing. My current project is sort of a docu-poetics project about my family's experience of the Nazi occupation of the Netherlands. My mom was born in the Netherlands, immigrated here as a young child, which meant that my grandparents were still in Rotterdam during World War II. Mm-hmm. So the collection is tentatively titled Hunger Winter, and it is sort of a movement back and forth between history and my contemporary self, kind of processing this history through family archives, public archives, and focusing on sort of the intergenerational dissonance, but also resonances regarding the food insecurity that the Dutch people experienced during the Nazi occupation, which is where the title Hunger Winter comes from. Late in the war, after years of flooding farmlands and just thieving supplies from leather to produce, etc., the Dutch people endured a really severe winter, and about 20,000 people passed in the Netherlands as a result of this war-induced famine. And so that's what the project is working to render into poetry.
Oh my goodness! Well, I hope you reach out when you are at the point where you have advanced reader copies. I would love to be one of your advanced readers. That sounds like a wonderful, rich landscape to build poetry on.
It would be my honor, James.
Well, Katherine, thank you for sharing your poetry and your voice on the Viewless Wings Poetry Podcast.
Thank you. It was an absolute pleasure.
The Viewless Wings Poetry Podcast is written and produced by James Moorhead. You can follow me on Instagram, Threads, and YouTube at Viewless Wings. Hit subscribe to be notified of every episode of the Viewless Wings Poetry Podcast and spread the word with your poetry community.